I just want to check the account, he said softly, sliding the paper across the counter. The laugh came first, loud and sharp, cutting through the marble silence of the bank like glass shattering on concrete. Heads turned, pens paused mid-signature, and a security guard near the entrance smirked as if he had just witnessed the punchline to a joke he had heard 1,000 times before. In the center of it all stood Wesley Carter, 12 years old, thin as a shadow, holding a folded piece of paper with hands that trembled just enough to betray the courage it took to walk through those glass doors. His shoes were worn through at the toes, the left one held together by a strip of gray tape that had seen better days, and his hoodie hung loose on his small frame, faded from too many washes in sinks and laundromats where the water ran cold. His hair was neatly cut, though, sharp and clean, because someone had cared enough to make sure he looked dignified, even when the world decided he was not. He stood straight anyway, shoulders back, eyes forward, like he had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times while lying awake under bus stop benches, listening to his grandmother's labored breathing in the cold night air. I just want to check the account, Wesley said again, his voice soft but steady, sliding the paper across the polished counter toward the man whose name tag read Bradley Knox in bold, confident letters. Bradley did not look at the paper at first. He looked at Wesley, and then he smiled, and then he laughed again, louder this time, performative, meant for the audience of strangers who had stopped their own transactions to watch. An account, Bradley repeated, dragging the word out like it was something ridiculous, something impossible. You mean a piggy bank, kid? A few people chuckled, not loudly, just enough to sting, just enough to remind Wesley that the world had already decided who mattered and who did not. Wesley's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, knuckles pressing white against brown skin. But he did not cry. He did not argue. He just stood there with his grandmother's words echoing in his mind like a prayer. It's my grandmother's account, Wesley said, his voice barely louder than a whisper, but somehow filling the entire room. She told me to come. That made it worse. Bradley leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. Son, this is a private bank, he said, each word dripping with condescension. We don't play pretend here. Someone in line whispered something to the person beside them. Another shook their head and looked away, already bored, already convinced this was a waste of time. Wesley could feel the room deciding, could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on his shoulders like hands pushing him toward the door. Bradley finally glanced at the paper, just for a second, just long enough to roll his eyes and sigh like he was doing Wesley a favor. You people always come in with scraps, he said, and the word you landed hard, sharp, deliberate. Wesley swallowed, his throat tight, his chest burning with something he could not name yet. His name was Wesley Carter, and he had slept the last 3 nights under a bus stop bench with his grandmother Eleanor, listening to her cough quietly so she would not wake him, watching her hand shake as she folded that same piece of paper and pressed it into his palm. She said the money is still there, Wesley said, his voice cracking just slightly. She said it never moved. Bradley tapped his keyboard, slow and dramatic, like he was humoring a child who believed in fairy tales. Fine, he said, smirking. Let's check this miracle. The screen loaded, the numbers appeared, and the laughter stopped. Before we continue with this story, tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Someone near you might be watching too. And don't forget to subscribe to support and appreciate the work we do on this channel. Silence is supposed to be empty, but this silence had weight, the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Bradley Knox froze, his fingers hovering above the keyboard like they had forgotten how to move, and the smug ease he had worn just seconds ago slipped off his face in slow motion, replaced by something tighter, something careful, something that looked almost like fear. He leaned closer to the monitor, blocking it with his body as if hiding it could change what was already there, and his jaw tightened in a way that told Wesley everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. Wesley noticed everything because survival had taught him to watch people's faces the way hunters watch shadows in the forest. He noticed how Bradley glanced over his shoulder toward the line of customers who were suddenly pretending not to stare, how his lips pressed into a straight line like he was holding back words that wanted to escape, how his hand moved to adjust his tie even though it did not need adjusting. "What's taking so long?" someone muttered behind Wesley, the irritation in their voice cutting through the tension like a knife through butter. Bradley cleared his throat, too quickly, too loudly. "System's slow," he said, but his voice had changed, softer now, careful, like he was walking on ice that might crack beneath him at any moment. Wesley nodded slowly because he was good at waiting, had spent his entire life waiting for buses that never came, waiting for shelters that were always full, waiting for his grandmother to wake up from coughing fits that sounded like they might steal her last breath. Bradley turned the screen slightly away from Wesley now, angling it so the boy could not see, and that small movement spoke louder than any words could have. A woman at the next counter leaned closer to her teller, whispering something urgent, and a man in a business suit folded his arms and frowned, sensing the shift in the room's energy like animals sense storms before they arrive. The security guard straightened up, suddenly alert, his hand drifting toward his belt, his eyes narrowing as he tried to understand what had changed. Bradley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound that made everyone wince. "You need to take a seat," he said to Wesley, his voice calmer now, but not kinder, controlled in a way that felt dangerous. "We'll verify this." Wesley looked at the plastic chair against the wall, the one meant for people filling out forms they did not understand, and something in him resisted. "I can stand," he said quietly. "My grandma said." Bradley's mask slipped. "I said sit," he snapped, sharp and sudden, like a dog that had been cornered. Wesley sat, not because he was afraid, but because his grandmother had taught him to pick his battles, to save his strength for moments that mattered. From the chair, he could see Bradley whispering urgently to a younger employee named Chelsea Reed, her eyes widening as she looked at the screen, then at Wesley, then quickly away as if looking too long might implicate her in something she did not understand. Minutes crawled by, each one stretching longer than the last, and Wesley watched Bradley make a phone call, turning his back fully now, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Wesley caught fragments, pieces of sentences that floated across the room like smoke. "No, that can't be right," Bradley hissed into the phone. "Check the history, yes, all of it." A man in line scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Told you," he said to no one in particular. Another sob story. Wesley lowered his eyes, not because he believed it, but because he had learned that looking up too long invited trouble, invited questions, invited the kind of attention that could get you hurt. Then Bradley hung up the phone, and when he walked toward Wesley, each step was measured, careful, like he was crossing a bridge made of rope and hope. "Where did you get this paper?" Bradley asked, and his voice had changed again, quieter now, almost respectful, and that scared Wesley more than the laughter ever had. "My grandma," Wesley said. "She worked her whole life." Bradley's eyes flickered. "Worked where?" Wesley sat up straighter. "She was a teacher," he said, and there was pride in his voice, the kind that could not be mocked away. 40 years. Bradley exhaled slowly, and it sounded like surrender. "We may need to place a temporary hold on this account," he said, and the word hold landed like a threat, like handcuffs, like a door slamming shut. Wesley stood, his heart pounding. "She needs that money," he said, his voice steady but tight. "She's sick." Bradley straightened his tie again, his armor back in place. "Then she should have come herself," he said, and the room leaned in, waiting, watching, judging. Somewhere far from that bank, in a place Wesley could not see, a phone vibrated in a man's pocket, and a countdown began that would change everything. The words came out of Bradley's mouth like they cost nothing, like he was ordering coffee or asking about the weather, casual and careless and cold. "Put the account on hold," he said, and something invisible snapped tight around Wesley's chest, squeezing until breathing felt like work. Chelsea hesitated, her fingers hovering above the keyboard like they knew something her mind had not processed yet, and she looked up at Bradley with confusion written across her face. "Sir," she said quietly, carefully, the way you speak when you know you are about to contradict someone who does not like being contradicted. "There's no irregular activity. The deposits are consistent. Decades of them." Bradley lowered his voice, but not enough, not nearly enough. "I'm not discussing this," he said, each word clipped and final. "Do it." Wesley stood again, his legs shaking, but holding his voice steady even though his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "What does that mean?" he asked. "My grandma told me the money is for the hospital." Bradley turned slowly, deliberately, like he had been waiting for this exact moment, like he had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. "It means," he said, drawing the words out, savoring them, "that we can't release funds until we verify the source." Wesley felt something hot rise in his throat. "The source is her job," he said, and his voice was louder now, more forceful. "She taught kids to read." A few people shifted uncomfortably in line. Someone cleared their throat, and the security guard took a step closer, his hand resting near his belt, just in case things went wrong, just in case this homeless kid with the taped-up shoes decided to make trouble. Bradley smiled again, but this smile was different, colder, sharper, like a blade hidden behind politeness. "Son, people lie," he said, shaking his head as if explaining something obvious to a child who should already know better. "All the time, especially when large amounts of money are involved." Wesley's breath caught. "How large?" he asked before he could stop himself, before his brain could catch up to his mouth. Bradley paused, and that pause stretched across the room like a confession, like an admission of something he had not meant to reveal. Chelsea's face had gone pale now, drained of color, and she leaned toward Bradley, whispering urgently, her words tumbling over each other. "Sir, this account predates the branch. It's been untouched for years. There's no reason to." Bradley cut her off with a raised hand, swift and dismissive. "Enough," he said, and Chelsea fell silent, her lips pressed together, her eyes saying everything her voice could not. Bradley turned back to Wesley, and his expression had hardened into something cruel, something final. "Where's your grandmother now?" he asked. Wesley swallowed. "At the shelter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They told us to leave this morning." Bradley nodded slowly, like he was confirming something he had already suspected, like this information proved a point he had been trying to make all along. "Then you'll need to bring her in," he said, listing requirements like items on a grocery list. "With identification, medical records, proof of residence." Wesley felt the floor tilt beneath him. "We don't have a residence," he said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. That did it. That was the moment Bradley had been waiting for, the moment that justified everything he had done and everything he was about to do. His expression hardened into stone. "Then we're done here," he said, and he gestured toward the security guard with a casual flick of his wrist, like ordering furniture moved, like dismissing a servant, like erasing a problem. The guard stepped forward, not unkind but firm, his voice carrying the weight of authority that could not be questioned. "Kid," he said, placing a hand near Wesley's shoulder without quite touching him, "you need to leave." Wesley felt heat rise behind his eyes, felt tears threatening to spill, but he did not cry because his grandmother had taught him that tears were private, that crying in public gave people power over you, that dignity was something you held onto even when everything else was taken away. He thought of her hands, rough from years of chalk dust and cleaning supplies she used to scrub floors when teaching did not pay enough, and he thought of her whispering in the dark, her voice hoarse and tired but still strong. "The money is still there, Wesley. Don't let them scare you." Wesley looked around the bank, at the people who had laughed earlier, at the ones who stared now, with pity or judgment or boredom, at the ones who looked away because watching felt like complicity. No one spoke, no one moved, no one offered help. As Wesley was guided toward the glass doors, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a vibration he almost did not notice, a message from a number he barely recognized. "Lawrence, I'm on my way. 20 minutes. Wesley stepped outside into the cold air, the glass doors sliding shut behind him with a softness that sounded final. And inside the bank, Bradley Knox finally exhaled, his shoulders dropping, his face relaxing into relief. He did not know yet that he had just made the most expensive decision of his life, that those 20 minutes would cost him everything he thought he had built, that the boy he had just dismissed would return with a force he could not imagine. Subscribers already know who's about to walk through that door. Don't get left behind when everything flips. Subscribe to the channel now. 20 minutes sounds like nothing until you are the one standing outside in the cold, watching your entire world collapse through a glass door you cannot open. The glass door shut with a soft hiss, but to Wesley, it sounded like a lock snapping closed, like a prison gate, like the final word in a conversation he never got to finish. Cold air rushed at him the moment he stepped onto the sidewalk, wrapping around his thin hoodie like it was trying to remind him exactly where he stood in the world, exactly how little he mattered to the people inside those warm, polished walls. Cars passed without slowing, people walked by without looking, and life kept moving, careless and fast, while Wesley's felt stuck right there on the concrete outside a bank that had just decided he did not belong. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, insistent, urgent. "Lawrence, 15 minutes. Don't leave." Wesley leaned against the brick wall, pulling his knees up slightly, trying to make himself smaller without meaning to, and he stared at the bank logo above the door, clean and polished and confident, everything his life was not. Inside, through the glass, he could see Bradley pacing now, and the manager's calm had cracked like ice on a frozen lake. Papers moved from one desk to another. Chelsea whispered to another teller with her hand covering her mouth, and the security guard stood closer to the door than before, like he was guarding something precious from the dangerous outside world. Wesley closed his eyes for a moment and thought his grandmother, Eleanor Carter, and he could hear her voice clearly, like she was standing beside him with her hand on his shoulder. "Wesley, dignity is something no one can take unless you hand it over," she had said years ago, back when they still had an apartment, back when she came home tired but smiling, her bag full of papers to grade, chalk dust clinging to her sleeves like evidence of a day well spent. She had never talked about the money much, only that it was for emergencies, only that she trusted it because she trusted the work that put it there, the decades of early mornings and late nights, and students who forgot her name the moment they left her classroom. The memory burned in Wesley's chest like a coal that would not go out. Inside the bank, Bradley stopped pacing and leaned over Chelsea's shoulder, pointing at the screen again, his voice low but sharp, and she shook her head slowly, then faster, like she was trying to refuse without saying the word out loud. A man exited the bank and brushed past Wesley, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he muttered under his breath, "Kids these days, like Wesley was the problem, like standing outside a bank was somehow proof of guilt." Wesley did not look at him, kept his eyes on the door, kept his breathing steady. Another buzz. "Lawrence, 10 minutes. Wesley's heart picked up speed, hope creeping in like sunlight through storm clouds, dangerous and bright and impossible to ignore. He had learned not to trust hope too much because hope had disappointed him more times than he could count, but it was hard not to feel it when someone was actually coming, when someone had said his name and meant it. The door opened suddenly, no warning, and Bradley stepped out onto the sidewalk, bringing with him the smell of cologne and confidence and control. He looked Wesley up and down again, slower this time, taking in every detail like he was cataloging evidence. "You're still here," Bradley said, and there was surprise in his voice, like he had expected Wesley to disappear, to vanish like all the other problems he had dismissed over the years. Wesley met his eyes without flinching. "You told me to leave," he said quietly. "I left." Bradley smirked, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. "Good," he said, turning back toward the door. "Stay gone." Wesley felt something rise in his chest, something heavier than anger, something older than fear. "You froze the account," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "That money is for her medicine." Bradley's smile thinned into a line. "If everything checks out," he said, waving his hand dismissively, "there's nothing to worry about." Wesley stood straighter, shoulders back. "She taught kids for 40 years, he said, and his voice carried across the empty sidewalk. "She never missed a day unless she was sick." Bradley stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Wesley. "And now she's homeless," he said, leaning in so close Wesley could see the pores on his nose. "Life's funny that way, isn't it?" The words landed like a slap, like a hand across the face, and before Wesley could respond, before he could even process the cruelty of it, a black sedan pulled up to the curb, smooth and quiet, the kind of car that did not need to announce itself. The driver stepped out first, moving with precision, and opened the back door with practiced efficiency. A tall man in a simple coat stepped onto the sidewalk, gray at the temples, calm eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. No hurry in his movements, no fear in his posture. He looked at Wesley first, really looked at him, seeing him in a way no one else had all day. Then he looked at the bank, studying it like a chess player studies a board. And then, very slowly, he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Bradley Knox take an involuntary step backward. Some people command a room by shouting, by demanding, by taking up all the space and air until everyone else shrinks back. But Lawrence Hale was not one of those people. The first thing Bradley noticed was the silence the man brought with him. Not the kind that comes from fear or intimidation, but the kind that makes people stop talking because something important has just arrived, something that deserves attention. Lawrence did not rush, did not glare, did not point fingers or raise his voice. He simply stood beside Wesley, close enough that the boy could feel warmth radiating through the thin fabric of his hoodie, and that simple act of standing together changed everything. "Are you Wesley?" the man asked, his voice calm and measured, like he had all the time in the world and was willing to spend it right here on this cold sidewalk. Wesley nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, sir." Lawrence placed a gentle hand on Wesley's shoulder, and it felt like an anchor, like something solid in a world that had been spinning out of control. "I'm Lawrence Hale," he said, looking directly into Wesley's eyes with the kind of respect the boy had not seen all day. "Your grandmother sent me." Bradley stiffened, his posture changing from confident to defensive in the span of a heartbeat, and he stepped forward, forcing a laugh that sounded practiced, rehearsed, like something he had used 1,000 times to dismiss people he considered beneath him. "Sir, this is a private matter," Bradley said, his voice tight. "If you're family, you can schedule an appointment." Lawrence looked at Bradley then, really looked at him, calm and direct and unflinching, and the weight of that gaze made Bradley's smile falter. "I'm not family," Lawrence said simply. "I'm a fiduciary." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge, like a bomb with a timer no one could see, and Bradley blinked, his brain struggling to process what he had just heard. "Excuse me," he said, and for the first time, there was uncertainty in his voice. Lawrence turned slightly, addressing both of them now, his voice carrying across the sidewalk with quiet authority. "For the past 27 years, I have overseen a trust funded entirely by Eleanor Carter's earnings," he said, each word landing with precision. "Teacher's salary, no inheritances, no outside contributions. Every dollar accounted for." Chelsea had stepped closer to the glass doors now, drawn by something she could not explain, her face pressed against the window like a child watching something forbidden, and the security guard shifted his stance, suddenly unsure whether he should be protecting the bank or listening to what this man had to say. Bradley laughed again, but it sounded thinner this time, hollow, like air escaping from a punctured tire. "If that were true," he said, crossing his arms over his chest in a gesture that was supposed to look confident, but only looked defensive, it would have triggered review long ago. Lawrence nodded slowly, like he had expected this exact response. "It did," he said, his voice never rising, never wavering. "Repeatedly, and every time it passed." Wesley watched Bradley's face change again, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his eyes dart toward the bank doors as if looking for an escape route, and something deep inside Wesley's chest began to unclench, began to hope. "You froze her account," Lawrence continued, his voice still steady, still calm, like he was simply stating facts that could not be disputed. "On what grounds?" Bradley straightened his tie, a nervous gesture that betrayed everything his words tried to hide. "We have protocols," he said, but his voice lacked conviction now, lacked the sharp edge it had carried just minutes ago. Lawrence's expression did not change. "Protocols require cause," he said. "Show me yours." Bradley hesitated, just a beat too long, just enough to reveal that he had no answer, no justification, no defense. Lawrence looked past him, through the glass doors into the bank where people were now openly staring. "May we go inside?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. "Or would you prefer we continue this conversation on the sidewalk?" A small crowd had gathered now, people slowing as they passed, pretending to check phones or tie shoes, Drawn by the tension they could feel radiating from this confrontation. Cars slowed, drivers craning their necks to see what was happening, and Bradley felt the weight of all those eyes, felt his authority crumbling with every second that passed. He forced another smile, brittle and thin. "Of course," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This way." Inside, the bank felt smaller somehow, brighter, the lights too harsh, the air too clean for what was about to happen. Lawrence walked to the counter without asking permission, without waiting for an invitation, and his confidence filled the space in a way that made everyone else feel like spectators in a play they had not auditioned for. "Pull the full account history," Lawrence said to Chelsea, not as a request but as a simple instruction, "including subaccounts and long-term holds." Chelsea glanced at Bradley, her eyes asking a question her mouth did not dare voice, and Bradley, for the first time in his career, did not stop her. The screen filled with numbers, dates stretching back decades, deposits so consistent they looked like heartbeats on a monitor, and Lawrence leaned in slightly, studying them with the focused attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "Eleanor Carter saved $1 for every 2 she spent," Lawrence said, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent bank. "She rode buses when she could have driven. She wore coats until they thinned at the elbows. She planned for a future she might never see, and she did it with a discipline most people cannot imagine." Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "And today," Lawrence said, turning to look directly at Bradley, his calm eyes now holding something sharper, something harder, "you laughed at her grandson." The room held its breath, every person frozen, and Wesley looked up at Lawrence, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. "Is my grandma okay?" Wesley asked, his voice small and scared and young. Lawrence squeezed his shoulder gently. "She will be," he said, his voice softening for the first time, "because some mistakes can still be undone." Bradley stared at the screen, sweat forming at his hairline, his hands trembling slightly, and the number was there, glowing on the monitor, impossible to deny. He just had not looked long enough yet, had not wanted to see what his arrogance had tried to hide, and now there was nowhere left to run. The monitor glowed like a lighthouse in a storm, cutting through Bradley's denial with the cold precision of mathematics that could not be argued with or laughed away. Bradley's fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen mid-air like they belonged to someone else, as if touching the keys might somehow confirm a nightmare he was desperately trying to wake up from. The account history scrolled across the screen in neat, merciless rows, decades of deposits meticulously recorded, each entry a testament to a life of sacrifice and discipline that Bradley had dismissed with a single cruel laugh just minutes ago. Wesley could hardly breathe, his stomach churning with the same sick feeling he got riding buses late at night when he did not know where they would end up, the same dread he felt sleeping on benches wondering if someone would chase them away before morning. And now, staring at that screen, he saw every dollar his grandmother had ever earned, every coin she had tucked away like tiny stubborn pieces of hope that refused to die. Bradley's laughter, so easy and confident before, had disappeared completely, replaced by a rigid tension that made his shoulders look like they were carved from stone. His eyes darted between Chelsea, the screen, and Wesley, trying desperately to locate some fault in a system that refused to bend to his arrogance, some error that would prove he had been right all along. But there was nothing, just row after row of proof that Eleanor Carter had done exactly what she said she had done. Lawrence stood beside Wesley with the calm intensity of someone who had seen this play out before, who knew exactly how it would end, and his voice carried across the room like the final word in a courtroom. Every dollar in this account represents 40 years of lessons, early mornings when most people were still sleeping, and late nights grading papers by lamplight while her own eyes burned with exhaustion, he said, and each word felt like it was being carved into the air itself. Your grandmother believed in saving, in planning, in doing right even when no one was watching, and this is more than money. Wesley, this is her legacy. Chelsea, still at the counter, pressed a finger against the mouse with a reverence usually reserved for sacred things, scrolling carefully through the subaccounts like an archaeologist uncovering something precious and fragile. "Sir," she whispered to Bradley, her voice almost breaking with emotion she had not expected to feel. "This is extraordinary. She never missed a single contribution. Not one. Not in 40 years. Bradley's eyes went wide, pupils dilating like he had just seen something impossible. And he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a small choking sound that died in his throat. He looked at Wesley standing there, small yet unshakable, dirt under his fingernails and tape on his shoes, and then back at the screen where numbers told a story his prejudice had refused to hear. His earlier arrogance felt fragile now, paper-thin and cracking like old paint on a wall that had finally been exposed to too much weather. A wave of disbelief washed over Bradley's face, followed quickly by something he had not expected to feel in a bank he had long considered his kingdom, something that tasted bitter and unfamiliar in his mouth, and that something was shame. Outside the glass doors, a few pedestrians paused without knowing why, sensing something monumental shifting in the air the way animals sense earthquakes before they strike. And inside, the room held its collective breath, waiting for the validation that was coming, the proof that 40 years of quiet struggle had not been in vain. Wesley, with his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape, realized that justice could sometimes arrive in the form of numbers on a screen, cold and undeniable, speaking louder than any voice ever could. And in that moment, he understood what his grandmother had been trying to teach him all along about dignity, about patience, about the power of simply refusing to give up even when the whole world tells you that you do not matter. Bradley's chair scraped against the marble floor with a sound so loud it made everyone in the bank flinch, echoing through the silence like the first crack in a dam that was about to break. He sank into it slowly, his polished shoes tapping nervously against the tile in an irregular rhythm that betrayed everything his face was trying to hide. And for the first time in his career, he realized that authority was not about titles on doors or name tags pinned to press shirts. It was about truth, and right now he was standing on the wrong side of it. Wesley's chest tightened, but he stayed perfectly still, rooted to the spot like a tree that had weathered too many storms to be moved by one more gust of wind. He had learned early, too early, that anger was useless against adults who refused to see you as human, who looked through you instead of at you. But there was something different in the air now, something that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Bradley's arrogance, once solid and unshakable as the marble beneath their feet, was now thin and fragile as ice in spring, and Wesley could see the hesitation in every twitch of Bradley's eye, every glance over his shoulder, every time his hand moved to adjust his tie that did not need adjusting. It was as if the numbers on the screen had grown legs and walked straight into Bradley's soul, forcing him to confront a reality he had spent years pretending did not exist. Chelsea hovered nearby, her face pale but determined, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Sir," she said softly, almost reverently, like she was speaking in a church or at a funeral, "the account is exactly as he said. Everything is in order, every deposit, every sub-account. She never missed a single one in 40 years. Bradley's hands gripped the edge of his desk, so hard his fingers went bloodless, and his lips moved, forming words he did not release, trying out different responses in his head and rejecting them all, because none of them could undo what he had done. None of them could erase the laughter that still hung in the air like smoke. The arrogance, the casual dismissal, the way he had looked at Wesley like the boy was garbage that had blown in through the doors. All of it had no armor now, no defense, no excuse. Wesley could see the man flinch under the weight of decades of disciplined labor that he had mocked without hesitation, could see him shrinking in real time like a balloon slowly losing air. Lawrence remained calm beside Wesley, his presence like a steady tide that pulls everything toward resolution, whether you wanted to go there or not. "You humiliated a child today," Lawrence said quietly, almost conversationally, like he was commenting on the weather or discussing lunch plans. "You laughed at someone who trusted you with something precious, with a lifetime of work, with hope. And for what?" His eyes locked onto Bradley's, holding him in place. All of this could have been avoided with basic respect, with simple human decency, with taking 5 minutes to actually look before you judged. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the entire room, and Bradley's jaw tightened so hard Wesley thought he might crack a tooth. His pride, which had always been a shield against criticism and doubt, shattered quietly with no dramatic outburst, no anger, no excuses, just silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any words ever could, the kind that forces you to hear your own thoughts and realize they are not as righteous as you believed. The people in line who had been watching silently felt the shift too, felt something fundamental change in how they saw Bradley Knox, and several of them looked away, suddenly uncomfortable, like they had just witnessed something private and painful that they should not have seen. Wesley breathed slowly, deliberately, pulling air deep into his lungs and letting it out in a controlled stream. The weight of the situation did not make him smile. Not yet. Not when his grandmother was still sick somewhere, still waiting, still hoping he would come back with good news. But deep inside, beneath the fear and exhaustion, there was a flicker of validation, a small bright spark that told him courage, the quiet kind that does not shout or make demands, had called forth justice without throwing a single punch. And in that room, for the first time since he had walked through those glass doors, Bradley Knox understood the power of dignity, understood that it could not be bought with money or authority, could not be mocked away with laughter, could not be stolen by someone who thought themselves superior. It could only be earned through years of showing up, of doing the work, of treating people with respect even when no one was watching. And he had failed at all of it, spectacularly and completely. What happens next will restore your faith in justice. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the moment Bradley's world collapses. Bradley's office had never felt smaller, never felt more like a cage built from his own choices. The polished surfaces that once reflected his success now seemed to mock him. The bright lights felt too harsh, exposing every flaw he had tried to hide behind confidence and protocol, and the carefully arranged paperwork that usually made him feel important now looked like props in a play where he had forgotten his lines. Every click of Chelsea's keyboard, every whispered word between her and Lawrence, every second that passed reminded him that control was an illusion he had taken for granted, something that evaporated the moment someone questioned it with facts he could not dispute. Wesley stood near the counter, silent but alert, his posture reminding Bradley of a soldier who had already faced too many battles but refused to retreat, and though the boy's hands were folded loosely in front of him, every inch of his body radiated a quiet tension that said he was ready for whatever came next. Wesley had learned early that silence could be louder than screaming, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand still and let the truth speak for itself. And today, in this bank that had tried to erase him, his silence was deafening. Chelsea moved through the bank's internal systems with a mixture of awe and urgency, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she scrolled through decades of Eleanor Carter's life, each transaction telling a story that made her chest ache. The deposits were meticulous, never flashy, never large enough to draw attention, just steady and consistent like a heartbeat that refused to stop, careful budgeting that spoke of someone who understood that survival required discipline, not luck, and not a single missed payment in 40 years, not one, which was more than most people could claim after 40 days. Lawrence stood beside Wesley with the calm assurance of someone who had seen this script play out before and knew exactly how it ended. "Do you see it now?" he asked softly, not as a question, but as a revelation, turning to address Bradley directly. Every dollar is proof of a life lived honorably, proof of sacrifice most people cannot fathom, proof that dignity is built one choice at a time over decades, and yet you thought you could dismiss it with a laugh, thought your title gave you the right to judge without looking. Bradley's lips pressed into a thin line, his face flushing with color that climbed from his collar to his hairline like a tide he could not hold back. His pride, once unshakable, now trembled under the weight of truth that refused to be denied or delayed, and the room seemed to shrink around him as the consequences of his arrogance pressed in from all sides. The customers who had been content to watch from a distance now leaned in subtly, drawn by the moral reckoning unfolding before them, and the security guard who had been ready to escort Wesley out now stood frozen, unsure whether his job was to protect the bank or witness history being made. Wesley's eyes met Bradley's for the first time since the account had been pulled up, and there was no fear in them, no anger, just the quiet intensity of someone who had already endured far more than his age should allow. "It's not just money," Wesley said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's my grandma's life. Every day she stood in front of classroom when her feet hurt. Every night she graded papers when she could barely keep her eyes open. Every choice she made to save instead of spend. This is what she earned, and you try to take it away because you didn't think she was worth the effort to check." The bank was silent, so silent you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, and the bystanders who had once been passive now leaned in with something that looked like respect, sensing that power had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat, his own voice failing him as the reality of accountability settled over the room like fog. And for the first time in his career, he realized that authority without respect is not just meaningless. It is dangerous. It is corrosive. It destroys the very thing it claims to protect. Outside, the city moved on, unaware and uncaring. People rushing to meetings and appointments that would be forgotten by dinner time. But inside this bank, the quiet justice of truth had arrived, unhurried and undeniable. And Wesley, standing small yet unwavering, had become its vessel, proof that sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen without a single raised voice. The cursor blinked on the screen like a heartbeat, steady and relentless, marking seconds that stretched longer than any seconds Wesley had ever known. One blink, two blinks, three, each one a reminder that something irreversible was about to happen, something that would change the shape of this room forever. Wesley could feel every eye in the bank on him now, not with judgment or pity or curiosity, but with anticipation, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your breath catch in your throat, the kind that tells you something monumental is coming whether you are ready for it or not. Every person there, from the tellers counting money behind bulletproof glass to the customers clutching their deposit slips, sensed that they were about to witness something rare, something they would tell their families about over dinner, something that would make them say, "I was there when it happened." Bradley stood frozen in place, his jaw so tight it looked like it might snap, fingers pressed against the counter hard enough to leave marks. And he had always believed that numbers could intimidate, that authority could silence dissent, that a well-placed laugh could control how people perceived reality. But today none of it worked. None of his tricks or tactics or carefully practiced dismissals could change what was glowing on that screen. Every carefully constructed wall of confidence he had built over years of telling people no, of making them feel small, of using his position to decide who mattered and who did not, all of it crumbled under the weight of truth that refused to be denied. Wesley's hands shook slightly as he reached toward the counter, not from fear but from the tension that had been building for weeks, months, years, the accumulated weight of sleeping on benches and eating food from shelters and watching his grandmother pretend she was not in pain when he knew she was dying by inches. This was more than a bank visit, more than checking an account balance. This was the validation of decades of sacrifice by Eleanor Carter, a woman who had worked tirelessly as a teacher, giving everything she had to children she would never see again, pouring her life into classrooms that never said thank you, saving money one painful dollar at a time, because she believed the future was worth preparing for even when the present was brutal. Every dollar in this account was proof that she had existed, that her life had meant something, that her choices had mattered, and now the world was finally watching. Lawrence remained calm beside Wesley, a silent pillar of assurance, his presence alone enough to steady the boy's racing heart. "You're witnessing something rare," Lawrence said quietly, his voice carrying across the hushed room, even though he barely spoke above a whisper. "Not everyone earns trust this way. Not everyone leaves a legacy that demands respect. Not everyone lives a life so disciplined that 40 years later the proof still stands unshaken." Chelsea scrolled carefully through the account history, her movements reverent, like she was handling ancient manuscripts in a museum. "Sir," she whispered to Bradley, her voice trembling with emotion she had not expected to feel for a stranger. "This is extraordinary. She's consistent in a way that defies explanation. Every deposit, every year, perfect timing, perfect amounts. She never missed a single one. The room grew heavier with anticipation, the air itself seeming to thicken, and Bradley's breath came in short, shallow bursts like he was drowning on dry land. He had no words left, no clever lines, no excuses that would hold up under scrutiny, and the numbers on the screen spoke for themselves, louder than any policy manual or corporate directive, louder than his title or his authority or his years of experience telling him he was right. Wesley's eyes met Lawrence's across the counter, and a small nod passed between them, subtle but loaded with meaning that only they understood, a silent acknowledgement that this moment had been coming for a long time and could not be stopped or delayed any longer. Lawrence took a step back, giving Wesley space, and Wesley reached out, his small hand hovering near the keyboard. Bradley leaned closer despite himself, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had everyone else in the room on the edge of their seats. And in that instant, suspended between past and future, everyone knew without being told that the balance reveal was coming, not just a number on a screen, but justice made manifest. Recognition earned through 4 decades of showing up when it would have been easier to quit, the culmination of a life lived with integrity that could not be mocked or dismissed or laughed away. In that moment, no one in the bank moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe, because they all understood on some primal level that they were about to see something extraordinary unfold, something that would remind them why dignity matters, why perseverance pays off, why the truth always finds a way to surface no matter how deep you try to bury it, and they would remember this moment forever. Some numbers whisper, some numbers shout, but this number detonated like a bomb in the center of the room, and the shockwave hit Bradley Knox, so hard his knees actually buckled. 9 figures stared back at him from the screen, not 7 like a comfortable retirement, not 8 like a successful career, but 9, a number so staggering it made his yearly salary look like the loose change people drop between couch cushions and forget about. The monitor glowed with cold mathematical certainty, indifferent to the drama exploding around it, and Bradley grabbed the edge of the counter with both hands like a drowning man clutching driftwood, his ties swinging forward to brush the keyboard, his breath coming in short gasps that sounded like he had just run a marathon. Time seemed to stop, the entire bank frozen in that crystallized moment when reality shatters every assumption you thought was solid, and then chaos erupted in slow motion as the truth detonated through the room like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Someone behind Wesley gasped, a sharp intake of breath that cut through the silence like a knife, and a woman dropped her phone, the clatter against marble echoing louder than it should have. "Wait, what?" A man whispered, his voice climbing with disbelief. "That can't be right. How many zeros is that?" The security guard's hand fell away from his belt, his jaw going slack. Suddenly understanding, he had been ready to forcibly remove someone whose grandmother possessed more wealth than he would see in 10 lifetimes of paychecks. Chelsea's hands trembled so violently, she had to clasp them together to make them stop. And when she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion that threatened to spill over into tears. "Here it is," she said, but the words came out barely above a whisper, reverent and awed, like she was announcing the discovery of something holy. Every deposit verified, every sub-account confirmed, 40 years of perfect consistency, and the total is... She paused, swallowing hard. 9 figures, sir, a teacher who saved over $100 million, $1 at a time. The number hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, visible and choking and impossible to ignore. Bradley blinked hard, once, twice, 3 times, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing, and the mocking laughter that had erupted from his throat just an hour ago when Wesley asked to check the account, that casual, cruel sound that had made strangers shake their heads and a boy's hand shake with humiliation, came rushing back to him like a recording played at full volume. And it sounded obscene now, monstrous, like laughing at a funeral or mocking a miracle. His own voice echoed in his memory. "An account? You mean a piggy bank kid?" And the shame hit him so hard he actually swayed on his feet. The number on the screen was more than money. It was 40 years compressed into proof that could not be argued with, 40 years of waking before dawn when her body begged for rest, 40 years of riding crowded buses when she could have bought a car, 40 years of eating simple meals and wearing old coats and saying no to every small comfort because she believed in building something that would last beyond her own life. Every deposit told a story of sacrifice so profound it made Bradley's chest hurt, and the total glared at him like an accusation written in fire, demanding he acknowledge what he had dismissed, what he had mocked, what he had laughed at without even looking. Wesley's chest swelled with relief, so powerful his vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall, and his knees felt weak, but he locked them, staying upright through sheer will. He did not cheer or celebrate or throw his arms in the air like people do in movies, because this was not about winning some game. This was about his grandmother's entire existence being validated after years of the world treating them both like they were invisible, like they did not matter, like their struggles were too small to notice. The people in line who had glanced at him earlier with mild curiosity or open contempt now stared with expressions transformed by shock, their faces cycling through disbelief to awe to something that looked like shame. "She saved that much?" someone whispered, the question rhetorical because the answer was glowing on the screen for everyone to see. "On a teacher's salary?" another voice added, wonder mixing with disbelief. "How can anyone laugh at that?" a woman said, and her eyes moved from the screen to Bradley with judgment so sharp it could cut. The whispers grew louder, spreading through the gathered crowd like wildfire, voices overlapping. "That's more than my entire neighborhood combined, and 40 years without missing once." And he laughed at a boy whose grandmother is wealthier than everyone in this building. Bradley's face drained of color, going from flushed embarrassment to pale shock, and the transformation happened so fast Wesley could track it in real time, like watching ice melt under a blowtorch. Pride did not just crumble, it collapsed completely, imploded with the force of a building demolished from within, and what remained was just a man, stripped of pretense, facing the catastrophic consequences of his assumptions. His fingers trembled above the counter, his mouth opened and closed without sound, and for the first time in his entire career, he understood with perfect clarity that authority means nothing without wisdom, that position grants no right to mock, that he had just laughed at a legacy more substantial than anything he would ever build. Wesley stood small in stature but towering in dignity, his shoulders straight and chin up, and he felt vindication wash over him not as triumph, but as relief, the kind that comes when a burden you have carried for too long is finally acknowledged by people who pretended not to see it. This was not about the money. It never had been. It was about respect for a life that gave everything without asking for recognition, about proving that some people build empires quietly through consistency and discipline while others just wear expensive suits and think that makes them important. Outside the bank windows, the city rushed past unaware, but inside these walls a single 9-figure number had just rewritten everything, had transformed a boy from dismissed to vindicated, had exposed a man's cruelty for what it truly was, and had proven once and for all that dignity, real dignity earned through decades of choices when nobody is watching, speaks louder than any laugh ever could. You just witnessed a 9-figure reveal. Subscribers get endings like this weekly. Most people will never know what happened next in that bank, but subscribers see the full story before it disappears. Bradley stood frozen like a statue carved from regret, his eyes locked on the screen as if the numbers themselves had turned into a verdict he could not appeal, could not dismiss, could not laugh away like he had laughed at Wesley just minutes before. The room was quiet, but it was not peaceful, not even close, because every person present felt the weight of that moment pressing against their chests like a physical thing, a tension so thick it made breathing feel like work. The silence had teeth, sharp and unrelenting, gnawing at Bradley's pride with every second that passed. And Wesley did not move, did not speak, because he had learned early that stillness can hold more power than 1,000 words. Wesley felt every heartbeat echoing in his chest like drums in an empty stadium, a rhythm that matched the fear and awe radiating from Bradley's face. And this was not just money on a screen. Never had been. It was decades of effort compressed into digits, decades of unseen sacrifice that had finally found a voice loud enough to cut through the noise of prejudice and assumption. Chelsea stepped back from the computer, finally allowing herself to breathe properly. And she had watched the account history scroll like a lifetime captured on film, each deposit a frame in a movie about persistence, each year a chapter in a book about refusing to quit even when the world tells you that you do not matter. She turned to Bradley, her eyes wide with something that looked like wonder mixed with disappointment. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying across the silent bank like a bell. She never missed a single contribution, not once in 40 years. Every deposit is there. Every record is perfect. This is extraordinary. Bradley's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the counter harder, trying to anchor himself to something solid in a world that had just tilted beneath his feet, and he had mocked this, had dismissed it, had laughed at a child who carried the weight of this legacy in his small hands. Lawrence's gaze swept across the room with the calm authority of someone who had seen this play out before and knew exactly how it ended. "Authority without respect is meaningless," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You mocked a child today, mocked someone who came to you in good faith, trusting that this institution would honor decades of honest work, and instead you gave him laughter and humiliation. You underestimated a legacy built one sacrifice at a time. And today, the truth has found you." The people in the bank leaned in subtly, some of them unconsciously holding their breath, sensing that they were witnessing a moral reckoning that did not need shouting or drama to be devastating. Even the security guard, trained to remain stoic and professional, allowed his eyes to linger on Wesley with something that looked like respect, aware that he was standing in the presence of something rare and powerful. Wesley finally exhaled, a slow, controlled release of tension he had not realized he had been holding since the moment he walked through those glass doors, and he looked at Bradley not with anger or triumph, but with quiet certainty, the kind that comes from knowing you have been vindicated by truth itself. "It wasn't just money," Wesley said softly, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. "It was her life, her work, every morning she woke up when it was still dark outside. Every night she graded papers until her eyes burned. Every choice she made to save instead of spend. This is her dignity written in numbers, and now you see it too." Bradley's jaw clenched so hard Wesley could see the muscles working beneath the skin, and for the first time in his entire career, the power dynamic had shifted on an axis he had never considered, flipped completely, irreversibly. The arrogance that once filled this room like expensive cologne had been replaced with something heavier. Something that tasted like shame and felt like accountability, the kind that could not be explained away with policies or procedures. Wesley, standing small but unshakable in his taped-up shoes and faded hoodie, realized in that moment that true justice often arrives quietly, without fanfare or celebration, but its impact echoes loudly through every person who witnesses it, changing them in ways they will carry long after the moment has passed. The room was electric with tension, though no one shouted. No alarms blared. No fists slammed on counters. Yet in the bank it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the consequences of decades-long injustice to finally settle like dust after an explosion. Bradley's usual confidence had evaporated completely, leaving behind a man who had built his entire career on authority and titles. Now confronted with a truth so undeniable, it could not be argued away with policies or procedures or the casual dismissals he had perfected over years of telling people no. The numbers on the screen were not just digits arranged in a particular order. They were Eleanor Carter's life condensed into cold, undeniable evidence that spoke louder than any witness could, every deposit a testament to sacrifice, every sub-account a chapter in a story about refusing to quit when quitting would have been easier, and they stared Bradley down with the merciless clarity of mathematics that cannot be negotiated with or charmed. Bradley's smirk, once so easy and dismissive it had become part of his professional armor, had disappeared entirely, replaced by something that looked like a man watching his own reflection shatter in slow motion. Wesley, still standing beside Lawrence with his shoulders straight despite the exhaustion that threatened to pull him down, felt a quiet sense of vindication washing over him like warm rain after a drought. He did not need to shout, did not need to gesture dramatically or make speeches about justice. He only needed to exist in that moment, to stand there as the living embodiment of dignity that Bradley had tried to mock into submission, and every inch of his posture screamed that he was the inheritor not of money, but of his grandmother's resilience, her integrity, her unshakable belief that doing right mattered even when no one was watching. Chelsea glanced at the monitor again, almost afraid to look away as if the numbers might disappear if she blinked, and her voice trembled when she spoke. "Sir," she whispered to Bradley, each word careful and weighted. "All accounts, all sub-accounts, every single transaction is verified and legitimate. There's nothing wrong, nothing irregular. This is exactly as he said it would be, exactly as his grandmother promised." Bradley exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to carry away years of arrogance like leaves blown from a tree in autumn, and his hands finally unclenched from the counter's edge, leaving white impressions where his fingers had gripped too hard for too long. He did not yell, did not fight, did not try to save face with excuses or blame. And for the first time in his professional life, he realized that the true cost of mocking a life like Eleanor Carter's was not anger or public shame. It was the private recognition that he had failed at the most basic human responsibility, the simple act of seeing someone as worthy of respect before judging them. Lawrence placed a reassuring hand on Wesley's shoulder, his touch gentle but grounding. "Sometimes justice doesn't roar like thunder," he said softly, his words meant for Wesley but carrying across the silent room to every ear that wanted to hear. "Sometimes it arrives quietly, with numbers that cannot lie, with truth that refuses to hide, with the simple presence of someone who will not be erased no matter how hard the world tries. And today, Wesley, it's here, standing right beside you." The people in line watched with expressions that had transformed from bored curiosity to captivated attention, some leaning slightly forward as if drawn into a story they could not turn away from even if they wanted to. And outside the glass doors, the city moved on in its usual chaos, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening inside these walls. But for those present in the bank, the lesson was impossible to ignore, seared into their memories with the permanence of scar tissue, a reminder that dignity cannot be frozen by bureaucracy, respect cannot be mocked away by laughter, and integrity always finds a way to reveal itself when given the chance. Wesley finally allowed himself a small smile, slow and controlled, not of triumph or revenge, but of pure relief, the kind that comes when a fight you've been fighting for so long finally ends not with your defeat, but with your validation. His grandmother's fight, her lifetime of care and discipline and sacrifice that no one had bothered to acknowledge, had been honored in the most public way possible, and Bradley Knox, standing rigid and silent, had no choice but to witness it, powerless to stop it, humbled beyond recovery, and changed in ways he would spend years trying to understand. The room felt heavier now, even though the numbers had been revealed, as if the weight of acknowledgement was somehow more oppressive than the weight of doubt had been. Bradley slumped slightly in his chair, not dramatically, but noticeably, a man stripped of the pride that had held him upright for so long, but not yet fully broken, just bent in ways that would never straighten back to their original shape. The quietness that followed the reveal was not emptiness or peace. It was tension transformed, a thick fog of realization settling over everyone present like morning mist that clings to skin and refuses to evaporate. Each person felt the weight differently, but no one could deny the fundamental shift that had occurred, the moment when power changed hands without a single violent act, when truth reasserted itself simply by existing in a space that had tried to deny it. Wesley's eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in every detail with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read situations the way sailors read weather. And he saw Chelsea standing at the counter, unsure whether to move or speak or simply observe, saw the customers behind the rope barrier leaning in with expressions that had evolved from judgment to something closer to respect, saw the security guard who had been ready to escort him out, now standing perfectly still as if afraid. Any movement might break the spell. Lawrence remained calm beside Wesley, a quiet sentinel who had seen enough of life to know that the most important moments often need silence more than commentary. And he was letting this moment breathe, letting it settle into the bones of everyone who witnessed it, so they would carry it forward into their own lives. Bradley finally found his voice, though it came out careful and clipped, measured in a way that suggested he was testing each word before releasing it into the world. "I underestimated you," he said, speaking to Wesley, but really speaking to himself, confronting his own reflection in the mirror of his mistakes. "I underestimated her, and I laughed where I should have listened, dismissed where I should have verified, judged where I should have respected." The words were small, but they carried a weight heavier than any previous outburst could have. Heavier because they were true, because they cost him something to say, because they were the first honest things he had spoken since Wesley walked through those doors. Wesley felt a strange calmness settle over him like a blanket after a long, cold night, and he had anticipated confrontation, had braced himself for anger or maybe even violence, had prepared speeches in his head about justice and fairness that he would never need to deliver. But this quiet acknowledgement of wrongdoing was almost more powerful than any loud apology could be, because it was real, because it was earned through evidence, not extracted through pressure, because it demanded reflection, rather than dismissal. Lawrence broke the silence gently, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that teaching moments require patience. Sometimes the most profound justice doesn't scream or demand or threaten, he said, looking at Bradley but speaking to the entire room. It doesn't need to, because it arrives through evidence that cannot be disputed, through persistence that refuses to quit, and through the dignity of those who refuse to compromise their principles, even when doing so would be easier. Chelsea looked at Bradley with a mixture of awe and relief, like she had been holding her breath for hours and could finally exhale. "Sir," she said softly, her voice carrying genuine emotion. She never asked for attention or recognition. She worked quietly for decades without complaint, but what you see on this screen is proof of her entire life. Proof of everything she sacrificed so that someone like Wesley could stand here today and demand the respect she earned. Bradley's hands shook slightly, just a tremor, but enough to show that his armor had cracked all the way through, and he swallowed hard, trying to find words that would make up for years of casual cruelty, for moments of mockery that he had thought were harmless, but now understood were devastating. Wesley stepped forward slightly, his movement calm but deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the silent bank with unexpected strength. "It wasn't just about money," he said, meeting Bradley's eyes without flinching. "It was about respect, about honoring someone who gave everything without complaint, about recognizing that some people build their lives one choice at a time over decades. And today we just proved that some things cannot be taken away, not by mockery, not by arrogance, not even by fear." The room remained quiet, but the air had changed completely, charged with understanding rather than tension. And for Wesley, for Lawrence, and even for Bradley Knox standing there stripped of pretense, nothing would ever be the same again. Bradley's office, once a fortress of control, where he had ruled with the casual confidence of someone who believed his position made him infallible, now felt like a glass house where every wall had cracked and every secret had been exposed to the unforgiving light of day. Every polished surface that had once reflected his success now seemed to mock him with his own image. Every framed certificate that proclaimed his competence looked like evidence in a trial against his character, and every gleaming pen that had signed documents denying people their dignity now felt like a weapon he had turned on himself. The balance on the screen glowed with the steady persistence of truth that refuses to hide, exposing not just Eleanor Carter's years of disciplined saving, but also the hollow arrogance that had defined Bradley Knox for far too long, and he could not look away from it no matter how badly he wanted to. Wesley stood quietly with his shoulders squared and his chin up, absorbing the moment with the careful attention of someone who understood that victories like this do not come often and must be remembered in detail. He was not triumphant in the way winners usually are, not vindictive or cruel. He was just present, fully and completely present, and that presence was somehow more powerful than any speech or celebration could have been. The boy who had walked into this bank with shoes held together by tape and a hoodie too thin for the weather now bore witness to a reckoning that words alone could never capture, a moment where his grandmother's life, her tireless work, her sacrifices that no one had bothered to count, had been honored through the undeniable language of numbers that could not be argued with or dismissed. Chelsea shifted uncomfortably at the counter, suddenly aware that she was not just an employee processing a transaction, but a participant in a story that mattered. A story where the quiet perseverance of one life had demanded recognition from a system designed to ignore people like Eleanor Carter. She scrolled carefully through every account and every sub-account, and they all spoke the same message in different ways, saying that integrity cannot be fabricated by clever accounting, cannot be laughed at by people who mistake authority for wisdom, cannot be ignored when it stands in front of you demanding to be seen. Lawrence's presence was steady and almost unnerving in its calm, like the eye of a hurricane where everything is peaceful even though chaos rages just beyond the edges. Control is not in power or protocol, he said softly, his eyes fixed on Bradley with the kind of gaze that sees through pretense to the truth underneath. It's in respect, in recognizing the humanity of every person who walks through those doors, and authority without respect is fragile. Bradley, so fragile that one honest conversation can shatter it completely. And today your mask has fallen. Bradley's face tightened as those words landed, each one finding its target with surgical precision, and he opened his mouth, searching desperately for a defense that would not sound like an excuse, an explanation that would not reveal how little he had thought of Wesley and his grandmother. But he found nothing because there was nothing to find. The room had shifted on an axis he had never bothered to consider, tilted toward a truth he had spent his career avoiding, and Bradley's carefully constructed authority was crumbling with every second that passed while the customers lingering by the doors and the security guard standing watch, and even Chelsea herself could feel the subtle seismic shift happening in real time. Wesley's gaze lingered on Bradley for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was steady and clear, carrying the weight of generations who had been dismissed and mocked and told they did not matter. "You laughed at someone who earned every cent she saved," Wesley said, and though his words were quiet, they filled the entire space like thunder rolling across an open plain. "But you see now that numbers are not just numbers, they are proof of a life lived with dignity and discipline and love, proof that cannot be erased by someone's opinion or mockery or prejudice." Bradley's hands trembled as he turned back to the screen, unable to avert his gaze from the evidence of his own failure, and the mask of control that he had worn for so long had shattered completely, leaving behind only the man underneath, exposed and humbled and forever changed. Outside the bank, the city remained oblivious to what had just transpired, but inside these walls a lesson had been etched permanently into the memory of everyone present, a reminder that respect cannot be demanded through authority. It can only be earned through recognizing the inherent worth of every human being who crosses your path. And when denied, truth has an unstoppable way of reclaiming its rightful place. Bradley Knox had never felt smaller in his life, and the irony was not lost on him that he was standing at full height while a 12-year-old boy somehow towered over him with nothing but the weight of truth. The polished floor reflected his rigid posture like a mirror he could not escape. The marble walls seemed to close in with each breath he took, and every eye in the bank was quietly judging him with a severity he had never experienced from the other side. His authority, once as untouchable as the vault behind him, had evaporated like morning fog under direct sunlight, leaving behind only the uncomfortable, undeniable truth that he had laughed at a child, and that child's life, represented in numbers that could not lie, had humbled him without a single shout or threat. Wesley did not move from his spot, did not pace or gesture or demand anything. He simply stood tall despite being smaller than everyone in the room, and yet somehow he commanded the space in a way that made Bradley's years of management training look like amateur theater. This was not a victory of anger or defiance or revenge. This was a victory of patience and integrity and resilience, the kind that comes from carrying the weight of years of sacrifice on shoulders too young to bear it and refusing to collapse under the pressure. The boy had carried his grandmother's legacy into this building like a sacred torch, and now, silently and without fanfare, the world was finally seeing it burn bright enough to illuminate every dark corner where prejudice had been hiding. Chelsea's hands shook slightly as she navigated the remaining account details, each entry telling a story that made her chest ache with emotions she had not expected to feel during what should have been an ordinary workday. The bus rides Eleanor Carter took instead of buying a car. The late nights spent grading papers when she could have been resting. The mornings when she woke before dawn to prepare lessons that students would forget within weeks. Every dollar reflected not just monetary value, but decades of unheralded effort that had gone unnoticed until this very moment. Lawrence's calm voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. You see, Bradley, some lessons cannot be taught by lectures or rules or threats or policies written in corporate manuals, he said, his tone measured and deliberate. They're taught by life itself, by moments like this when reality forces you to confront the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are. And the lesson here is simple but profound. Respect, dignity, and persistence are forces you chose to mock, and now they have shown you their power. Bradley's mouth opened and closed several times, his brain cycling through responses that all sounded hollow before they could reach his tongue, searching desperately for something to say that would undo the quiet devastation of his pride. But there was nothing, no combination of words that could erase the laughter he had unleashed or repair the damage his arrogance had caused. Every second of mockery had now been repaid by an unspoken reckoning that was somehow more painful than any public shaming could have been, and the lesson was sharp and undeniable, carved into his consciousness with the permanence of scar tissue. Wesley finally broke the silence, his voice soft, but carrying across the bank with unexpected authority. You might have power in this room, he said, looking directly at Bradley with eyes that had seen too much hardship to be intimidated by titles. But true power is not earned by positions or fear or making people feel small. It's earned by integrity, by showing up every single day, even when nobody notices, by respecting the lives of others no matter how small they seem or how different they look or how poor their clothes are. And my grandmother has more power in her worn-out shoes than you will ever have behind that desk. The people in the bank leaned in closer, aware they were witnessing something rare and precious, not a dramatic confrontation with raised voices and pointed fingers, but a moral reckoning that did not need volume to devastate, that proved sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest truths. Bradley's pride had crumbled into dust. Wesley's dignity stood unshakable, and the room had transformed into a silent courtroom, where justice had been served not through punishment, but through the simple act of recognition. And outside life continued as usual, but inside the lesson lingered like incense in a cathedral. It would not be forgotten, because humiliation can crush a person temporarily, but integrity elevates them permanently, and sometimes without even trying it teaches a lifetime of lessons in a single profound moment that changes everyone who witnesses it. The murmur of the bank customers grew louder, not with judgment, but with astonishment that rippled through them like electricity through water, and every eye had turned toward the desk where Bradley Knox now stood, stripped of the arrogance that had once made him untouchable, reduced to just a man who had made a catastrophic error in judgment that could never be undone. The numbers on the screen were no longer just figures arranged in rows and columns. They were a story of perseverance compressed into data, a narrative about sacrifice written in the language of mathematics that even the most skeptical person could not dispute, and the crowd could feel it in their bones, in the way their breathing synchronized, in the way their postures shifted from casual observation to reverent attention. Wesley remained composed on the outside, though inside his heart raced with the kind of adrenaline that comes not from fear, but from vindication. And he had walked into this room a boy in worn-out shoes and a faded hoodie, uncertain of how he would be received by a world that had spent his entire life telling him he did not matter. Yet now he stood as the embodiment of quiet triumph, a living testament to his grandmother Eleanor's life that no amount of mockery, could diminish. Every person present could sense that something monumental had occurred in this ordinary bank on this ordinary Tuesday, something that transcended the simple transaction of checking an account balance, something that spoke to the fundamental question of how we treat each other when we think no one important is watching. Chelsea glanced nervously at the bystanders, many of whom were shifting their weight from foot to foot, leaning in as though they could somehow touch the significance of this moment if they got close enough, and whispers rippled through the room like waves on a beach. "Is that really her life savings?" Someone breathed, their voice barely audible. 40 years of work, and he mocked it? Another asked, disbelief dripping from every syllable. How could anyone underestimate someone like that? A woman whispered to her companion, and her voice carried not judgment for Eleanor Carter, but for the man who had dismissed her so casually. Each comment, though hushed and careful, amplified the tension in the room and made Bradley's humiliation more tangible, more real, more impossible to ignore or explain away. Lawrence's calm presence anchored Wesley like a lighthouse anchors ships in a storm, and when he spoke, his words carried the force of a verdict delivered by a judge who had seen all the evidence and reached an inescapable conclusion. "Authority without respect is meaningless," he said softly, yet every syllable cut through the air with precision. "You believe that laughter could diminish a legacy built over 4 decades, that your position gave you the right to mock someone's life work without consequence. But today the legacy has spoken in a language that cannot be misunderstood, and the laughter has ended forever." Bradley's lips pressed into a tight line as thin as paper, and the crowd could see him flinch under the weight of collective judgment that pressed down on him from all sides, could see the moment when he realized that being watched did not just mean accountability. It meant having his failures reflected back at him through the eyes of strangers who would remember this day long after he had forgotten their faces. For the first time in his career, he understood that authority is a borrowed thing that can be revoked in an instant, but respect is earned slowly over years and can be lost in seconds through carelessness or cruelty. Wesley's voice cut through the hushed murmurs with unexpected strength, calm, yet commanding in a way that made even the security guards stand straighter. "It was not just about money," he said, his words deliberate and measured. "It was about respect for a life that gave everything without asking for recognition, about honoring someone who worked when others rested, who saved when others spent, who believed that dignity matters even when the world says it does not." The room exhaled as one, a collective release of tension that had built minute by minute since Wesley first walked through those glass doors, and outside people passed by unaware that history was being made in quiet ways, but inside the silent justice of dignity had been fully revealed and witnessed. Bradley Knox would never forget this moment, would carry it with him through every future interaction, would hear Wesley's words echoing in his mind whenever he looked at someone and made assumptions based on appearances, and for the crowd witnessing it, the lesson was seared into memory with the permanence of a brand. True respect is earned through recognizing the humanity in every person, and integrity always leaves a mark that time cannot erase. The tension in the bank had become almost tangible, like electricity hanging in the air before a storm breaks, and you could feel it pressing against your skin, making the hairs on your arms stand up in anticipation of something that could not be stopped or reversed. Bradley Knox, once the embodiment of authority with his pressed suit and polished shoes and name tag that proclaimed his importance, now seemed small and diminished. Every ounce of arrogance drained from his posture like water from a broken vessel, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a man who had finally confronted the cost of casual cruelty. The numbers on the screen glimmered with the quiet weight of truth that refuses to be hidden, reflecting decades of Eleanor Carter's unwavering commitment to a future she believed in even when the present tried to break her. And for the first time in his career, the room recognized what Bradley had overlooked in his rush to judgment. Respect cannot be fabricated through policies or procedures. It must be earned through seeing people as they truly are rather than as you assume them to be. Wesley's hands were folded calmly in front of him, steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside his chest. But inside that calm exterior lived relief and pride and vindication all tangled together like roots of an ancient tree, tempered by years of hardship that had made patience his second nature and dignity his armor. He had expected confrontation when he walked through those glass doors, had braced himself for anger or perhaps even violence, had prepared himself to be dismissed again and again until someone finally listened. But instead he faced a quiet reckoning that was somehow more powerful than words or shouts could ever convey, a moment where truth simply existed and forced everyone to acknowledge it without argument. Chelsea finally broke her own silence. Her voice trembling just slightly with emotion she had not known she was capable of feeling for a stranger whose life she had only glimpsed through account records. "Sir," she said, addressing Bradley but really speaking to everyone in the room, "every deposit, every account history, every single year of contributions, it all lines up perfectly. This is a life of discipline and care that most people only dream about achieving. This is her story written in numbers that cannot lie." And we almost dismissed it without looking. Her eyes darted briefly to the bystanders who were leaning in now, completely captivated by the quiet drama unfolding before them. And the room was not just watching Bradley anymore. It was watching justice take its subtle, inevitable form, the kind that arrives without fanfare, but leaves permanent impressions. Lawrence, standing calm and unyielding beside Wesley like a mountain that has weathered 10,000 storms, addressed the room without raising his voice because he understood that truth does not need volume to be heard. We often believe power comes from titles or wealth or the ability to intimidate others into submission. He said, his words measured and deliberate. But real power, the kind that lasts beyond a single moment or transaction, comes from integrity that cannot be shaken, from perseverance that refuses to quit even when quitting would be easier, and from respect that recognizes every human being as worthy of dignity regardless of their circumstances. And today, the balance on this screen has spoken louder than any policy manual or corporate directive ever could. Bradley's hands shook almost imperceptibly as he leaned closer to the screen, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts, and the laughter that had once bubbled out of him at the sight of a worn-out child standing at his counter was gone completely, replaced by comprehension that arrived slowly and painfully like dawn breaking over a battlefield. His assumptions, his mockery, his underestimation of Eleanor Carter had been entirely and catastrophically wrong, and there was no policy he could cite, no procedure he could follow, no excuse he could manufacture that would undo the damage or erase the memory of this moment from the minds of everyone watching. Wesley's eyes met Bradley's with calm certainty that needed no reinforcement, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of generations who had been dismissed and overlooked and told they did not matter. "You thought you were above judgment," Wesley said quietly, but his words filled every corner of the silent bank. "You thought your position gave you the right to mock people without consequences, but integrity does not need your permission to exist. And today it has spoken for those who worked silently for decades, for those who earned respect without ever demanding it, for those who built legacies one choice at a time when the world was not watching." The people in the room shifted collectively, the weight of the lesson settling on everyone like snow falling on a quiet night. And this was more than money or account balances or banking procedures. This was the turning point where patience and persistence and quiet courage had rewritten the balance of power forever. And outside life went on unaware, while inside the course of one man's pride and one boy's dignity had irreversibly and permanently changed. The air in the bank had shifted completely, transformed from casual indifference to something that felt almost sacred, and what had started as mild curiosity from the customers waiting in line had evolved into collective awe that held them motionless like statues bearing witness to history. Every eye was fixed on Bradley Knox, who now looked smaller than ever though he still occupied the same space behind the counter. His physical presence diminished by the moral weight pressing down on him from all sides, and the glow of the computer screen reflected off his tense features, illuminating the truth he had spent the last hour trying to deny. Wesley stood quietly beside Lawrence with his shoulders straight and his breathing controlled, a boy who had learned that survival means reading every room you enter, sensing every shift in power, understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is simply refusing to disappear when people want you gone. He did not gloat or celebrate or make grand speeches about victory. He did not need to, because the quiet power of integrity and patience had already spoken in a language that transcended words, and every deposit in Eleanor Carter's account told a story not just of money saved, but of decades of hard work and sacrifice and quiet dignity that Bradley Knox had mocked without hesitation. Chelsea's voice trembled slightly when she spoke again, but there was an undeniable authority in her tone that had not been there an hour ago, a confidence that comes from witnessing truth triumph over prejudice. "Sir," she said, her words careful but firm, "this is not just a bank account. This is not just numbers arranged in columns and rows. Every record here reflects the lifetime of careful planning and sacrifice and dedication that most people never achieve. It is more than data. It is proof of a life lived with integrity that cannot be questioned or dismissed." Bradley's fingers hovered above the counter, almost unwilling to touch the surface that now seemed like a mirror reflecting his own failure back at him with merciless clarity, and he swallowed hard, the sound audible in the silence. The laughter he had released just an hour ago, that casual, cruel sound that had echoed across marble floors and made strangers shake their heads, now felt like a distant memory from another lifetime, replaced by an uncomfortable weight of humility that pressed against his chest and made breathing feel like effort. For the first time in his career, he understood that mocking someone's journey carried consequences far beyond the temporary amusement it provided, that words could wound in ways that lasted longer than physical injuries, that casual cruelty was not harmless just because it felt effortless. Lawrence's calm presence beside Wesley anchored the entire room like a keel anchors a ship in rough waters, keeping everything stable even as emotions threatened to capsize the moment. Power is not in intimidation or titles or the ability to make people feel small. "Bradley," Lawrence said, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of someone who had lived long enough to understand how the world actually works beneath its surface pretenses. "It is in respect, in persistence, in showing up for what truly matters, even when nobody is watching or applauding. And today you are witnessing that principle in action, seeing what happens when someone's life work demands recognition from a system designed to ignore it." Wesley finally spoke, his voice steady and measured despite the tremor that ran through his hands, and his words cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "You thought you could dismiss me with laughter, thought you could erase a lifetime of work with mockery and assumptions. But some things cannot be erased by arrogance or prejudice or the casual cruelty of people who mistake authority for wisdom and integrity, real integrity that is built through decades of choices when nobody is paying attention, always finds a way to reveal itself when given even the smallest chance." The room remained silent, but it was a silence heavy with understanding rather than discomfort, a silence that acknowledged something profound had just occurred, and Bradley Knox had learned a lesson louder than any words could convey, a lesson about the danger of judging people by their appearance, about the cost of dismissing someone's humanity, about the power of dignity that cannot be mocked away. For everyone else witnessing this moment, the lesson was equally clear and equally impossible to forget. True dignity can never be diminished by someone else's opinion, and true justice often arrives quietly without fanfare or celebration, leaving echoes that resonate long after the moment has passed, changing everyone it touches in ways they will carry forward into every future interaction for the rest of their lives. The bank felt impossibly still, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation of whatever came next. And Bradley Knox, who had once commanded this room with the effortless confidence of someone who believed his position made him infallible, now shifted uncomfortably as the weight of his own arrogance pressed down on him like a physical burden he could not shake off. His eyes darted toward the computer screen again, unable to escape the truth it displayed with the steady persistence of mathematics that refuses to negotiate or compromise. And there it was, decades of Eleanor Carter's life meticulously recorded in deposits that told the story of a woman who had sacrificed everything without complaint. Every digit a testament to patience and sacrifice and relentless dignity that could not be argued away. Wesley stood beside Lawrence with calm composure on the outside, but inside a whirlwind of emotions churned like a storm barely contained, and he had entered this building uncertain and exposed, wearing shoes held together by tape and carrying nothing but a folded piece of paper and his grandmother's whispered instructions, but now standing in the quiet aftermath of vindication. He understood something profound about the power of patience and truth. This was never about money alone, never just about numbers on a screen or account balances or banking procedures. It was about respect and recognition and the undeniable force of a life lived with integrity, about proving that some people build legacies not through fame or wealth, but through consistency and discipline and an unshakable commitment to doing right even when the whole world is looking the other way. Chelsea's hand shook slightly as she scrolled through the account history one more time, each transaction telling a story of endurance that made her chest ache with emotions she had not expected to feel during what should have been just another ordinary Tuesday at work. "Sir," she said softly, almost as if afraid to break the spell that had fallen over the room. "This is not just numbers on a screen. This is her life. Every sacrifice, every struggle, every choice she made to save instead of spend, all recorded and validated in a way that cannot be disputed or dismissed. And you mocked it. You laughed at her legacy without even looking." Bradley's shoulders slumped imperceptibly, a subtle surrender that everyone in the room could feel even if they could not see it. And he had no words left, no clever responses, no policies to cite that would make this right. He had thought himself untouchable, his mockery harmless, his authority unquestionable. But now the moral weight of the room bore down on him with the crushing force of accumulated judgment. And for the first time, he realized that authority without respect is not just meaningless. It is actively destructive, corrosive to everything it touches. Lawrence finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Real power, Bradley, is not in titles or intimidation or the ability to make people feel inferior," he said, his eyes locked on the manager with the kind of gaze that sees through pretense to the truth underneath. "It is in respect earned through recognizing the humanity of every person who walks through those doors, in lives honored rather than dismissed, in truths acknowledged rather than ignored, and today you are witnessing what happens when that power reveals itself." Wesley's gaze met Bradley's across the counter, steady and unwavering, and there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for revenge, just the quiet intensity of someone who had endured far more than his age should allow and refused to be broken by it. "You laughed at me," Wesley said, his voice quiet but filling every corner of the silent bank. "But the truth is stronger than mockery, stronger than prejudice, stronger than any assumption you made about who I am or what my grandmother's life was worth. And you underestimated someone who never needed your approval to succeed, who built something real through decades of showing up when it would have been easier to quit." The room exhaled collectively as tension broke like a fever finally releasing its grip, and outside the city moved on unaware of the transformation happening behind these glass walls. But inside, a boy had rewritten the course of a man's understanding, had forced everyone present to confront their own assumptions about worth and dignity and respect. And in that moment, suspended between what had been and what would come next, everyone present knew something profound had occurred, something that would echo through their lives long after they left this building, a reminder that humility could be forced by nothing but truth, and integrity always speaks louder than arrogance. Always find a way to surface no matter how deep you try to bury it. Always leaves a mark that time cannot erase. The bank had fallen into a reverent silence, so complete you could hear the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, heavy with the weight of revelation that had stripped away every pretense and left only raw truth standing in its place. Bradley Knox's usual domineering presence had evaporated entirely, replaced by a tension he had never known existed, a crushing awareness that every polished surface in his office, every framed certificate proclaiming his competence, every carefully chosen word in every corporate manual he had memorized, None of it could protect him from the simple, devastating fact that Eleanor Carter's decades of sacrifice and discipline were not something to be laughed at, mocked, or underestimated. They were a monument to integrity that demanded recognition whether he wanted to give it or not. The balance on the screen was no longer just a number. It had become something larger, a testament to resilience that transcended mathematics, proof that could not be erased by someone's opinion or prejudice or casual cruelty, and it glowed with the steady persistence of truth that refuses to hide, even when hiding would be more convenient. Wesley stood with unwavering calm, though inside his chest he felt the surge of relief and pride and vindication all crashing together like waves against rocks. And he had walked into this bank a boy in threadbare shoes and a hoodie too thin for winter, unsure how he would be received by a world that had spent his entire life telling him he was invisible. But now he was the embodiment of dignity itself, the silent force of a life well lived that could not be diminished by mockery or erased by authority. The room seemed to bend around him, every eye drawn to the quiet power of truth manifesting in real time. And people who had been strangers minutes ago now felt connected by this shared witness to something extraordinary. Chelsea shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment pressing upon her like physical pressure, and her hands hovered over the keyboard with reverence usually reserved for handling priceless artifacts. "This is not just numbers," she said softly, her voice carrying across the hushed bank with unexpected strength. "Every deposit, every record spanning 4 decades. It is proof of a life lived with integrity that most people only aspire to. You mocked her once without looking, but now the truth speaks louder than any policy or procedure ever could, louder than any words we could say." Bradley's hands trembled visibly now, a subtle quiver that betrayed the internal unraveling of a man who had thought power was about control and discovered too late it was about respect. And Lawrence's calm presence beside Wesley radiated quiet authority that needed no volume to be felt. Wesley finally spoke one last time, his voice steady and deliberate, carrying the weight of generations who had been dismissed and overlooked. "You thought laughter could diminish someone's life, thought mockery could erase decades of effort and sacrifice. But integrity cannot be laughed at or stolen or diminished by people who mistake their position for wisdom, and respect cannot be demanded through fear. It must be recognized in the quiet choices people make when nobody is watching." The crowd in the bank leaned in, riveted by the moral clarity of a 12-year-old boy who understood something most adults spend lifetimes trying to learn, and outside life moved on in its usual chaos, unaware that inside these walls a quiet revolution had occurred. Bradley Knox had been humbled not by anger or threats, but by simple, undeniable truth. Wesley's dignity had been honored in the most public way possible, and the lesson was crystal clear for everyone present. The balance was more than money. It was justice made visible. It was honor finally given, and it was a story that would echo through every conversation, every decision. Every moment when someone had to choose between dismissing a person or seeing their humanity. In that final moment, everyone understood with perfect clarity that true respect cannot be taken by force or bought with wealth. It can only be recognized in the lives of those who earn it through showing up day after day, year after year, decade after decade. And sometimes a boy in worn shoes can teach an entire room, even a powerful man, what it means to live a life of unwavering integrity that time itself cannot diminish. Over 2 million subscribers. Don't miss stories like Wesley's. Subscribe now before the algorithm buries this where you'll never find it again. Thanks for watching.